One of my goals of this talk is to convince Magnus to stop using sloth bots and to go over to slow bots. I would contend sloths don't have certificates in their operation biologically. But we do share this common interest in terms of understanding speed and the role of speed in robotic platforms. We can find that historically we have lots of robots that people have been awed with in terms of high-speed robots. But why? Why do we use speed? Why do we use slowness? What is the underpinning scientific question that we're trying to answer with velocity? And it can't be answered, I would contend, without acknowledging fully the coupling of the agent to the environment. This is really important. And we talked about ecological niches as well, and that's where these systems are going to reside. And I'll harken you back to Mark's comments yesterday in terms of long-term persistence in the environment, being around for extended periods. But keep in mind that ecological niches change over time as well. They are not necessarily stable. It's not that point in time that you can create and assume it will be there for extended periods. But my first concern is moving to one end of the spectrum, which is slowness, because speed has been explored. Understanding why it exists in nature, maybe for mammals. That was a great explanation that John contributed. I was glad to hear that. But why? So why would it bother to evolve into that particular case? So this whole notion of slow and fast can have, in particular, potential applications, especially in persistent agriculture, for example, where we're targeting individual plants and having these reside with them for extended periods of time. For military operations, of course, extended operations as well, being in the field for long periods of time. Animals tend to do something while they're out there, but they might not do a whole lot. And if you look at the activity budgets, as we'll see for the slow morse and the sloth in a little bit, you'll find that they really spend a lot of time sleeping in their lifetimes. So there seems to be some notion of wisdom with slowness. I mean, we talk about it. The tortoise and the hare is a classic example, of course, as well. Slow but sure, haste makes waste, and even if you like Simon and Garfunkel, slow down too fast, is another example as well, too. But biological economy exists, that this particular capability exists for a reason. These things exist in nature because they add some value to the agents in and of themselves. And some of those benefits, clearly, as was pointed out earlier, are conserving energy and also providing stealth. So it's not just avoiding the eagles, it's also not being detected by the eagles in the first place as well for these particular animals. And unlike some of the previous work, we're focusing on arboreal animals. Others have worked on slow robots. I mean, there's plenty of slow robots out there, sometimes unintentionally slow, but there are lots of slow robots. But different types of mechanical devices have been created and other aspects working in terms of protecting human beings in the environment when they're around them. But I'm interested in the underlying behaviors, as you might imagine, if you're familiar with some of my work over time. So the goal, ultimately, of this project, which is an O&R project, we're in our second year now, I guess. We started a bit slowly, tied out with some other work that we've had. But we're interested in this notion of having these systems live long and prosper in the environment with minimal human attention, to be able to carry out useful tasks, whatever they may be. And the first that come to mind, as I mentioned before, are agricultural and surveillance types of operations. And live there indefinitely. We're a long way from that right now. We talked about mechanical failures and other issues earlier as well, too, which impugn the ability to be able to accomplish these particular goals. But this notion of circadian rhythms is something that we're exploring as well, too. Nature exists in patterns and cycles. And the question is, acknowledging those cycles in these kinds of systems to be able to make them in a sub-deliberative way predictive. In other words, they can respond to what may happen in the near future by changing, in some cases, their velocities or behaviors or what have you, using this aspect. As I mentioned, these are some of the examples that we have. Well, as you may know, or not, I've been working in ethological models of animal behavior since my dissertation, initially starting with frogs and toads, moving on to things like sow bugs and praying mantids for NSF work, then working with Sony in developing ethological models for IBO and Curio as well too. That's Jim Carrey and the Truman Show, which would be the best example imaginable for a human ethologist, but obviously there's invasion of privacy issues associated with doing that. And then ONR work, looking at wolf pack behavior and deception, using eastern gray squirrels and prairie chickens for lecking behavior. So we've been doing this for a while, looking at different kinds of systems and trying to import some of the capabilities into robotic systems. The sloth is our current focus of attention right now. And there's some interesting quotes that refer to this, about this living in an energy-saving mode. And they are complete models of energy saving among the mammals. But there's so much more than that. They're not just energy-saving mammals. They are amazing mammals. And if you are guys who are going to be at, some of you at the Science of Autonomy meeting, John Pauly is going to be giving a keynote there for about an hour, talking about sloths as well too. And the mutualistic behaviors that they have, all kinds of interesting things. But they're not the only example, but here are some of the aspects. We're interested in the behavioral patterns that they have. Ethologists go out into the field. And they sit and watch these animals, sometimes with stopwatches, so that they can have the activity budgets that are associated with those. But they have been said to be relatively invisible to predators. They've also been called, the slowness itself has been called the ultimate weapon in an evolutionary war. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's interesting that someone would say that, and it points to its potential advantages. Their locomotion is kind of like walking, but in a non-brachiation way. If you're familiar with monkeys that swing through trees, which use the momentum, these guys are slow, is the best way to describe it. And there's all kinds of interesting things about them. Now, the slow loris is a primate, unlike the sloth. The slow loris is also one of only 2 venomous primates. It's interesting, I don't know what the other one is, I probably should find that out before I talk again, but nonetheless it is one. It's got venomous saliva. Oh, cute, this is one of the cutest animals you can imagine, right? It kind of fits in your hand. It's much smaller than 12 pounds, but it's a relatively small animal. But they're incredibly low basal metabolic rates. This is a picture of that scenario. He'll never get away. But somehow he doesn't have to get away. That's the interesting thing. That's the anomaly of this. There's some interesting, if I had known that this was not going to be a PG audience, I would have included some other, a little bit longer here, some of the interesting expletives that were used to describe this behavior. But the point is, looking at that, how can that survive in the wild? It can move faster under certain circumstances as well, but in general, it does not. And it is, as I mentioned, a primate. It is more social than the sloth. And that's why I like to use slow butts. I like to talk about multiple species that can contribute to a robotic system that might have useful attributes. It has a variation of communication, vocal calls, and the like. And it's slow in certain cases, but when it's just like the sloth, when it's down on the ground, it's in potential peril. Most sloths actually get killed on the ground while they're defecating, or in the process of going to defecate. And there's an interesting story, which I probably don't have much time to tell you about why sloths go down on the ground to poop, which has to do with the fact that they aggregate moths in their fur, lots of moths, which then feed the algae, which they eat while they're up in the tree, in their fur. Very interesting example of mutualism, which is another interesting side effect of these particular studies. But how we take these things that we find in nature and move them into robotic systems, as I said, something we've been doing for quite some time. It's best when you can have a biologist in tow unfortunately, we do have a biologist in tow in this particular case to help inform our studies. Ideally, we'd like to, if there were certain kinds of animals, to run experiments with them, but these animals are a little more difficult to do so. And in the case of the praying mantis, we create these models from an initial ethogram, import that into a structural model, which then gets translated into our Mission Lab software, where we run it in experiments and then run it on the actual robot as we move forward. So this is the process by which we do this, and this is the process by which we are doing this, as well as creating this far, if this is slow, far right, slow end of the spectrum for robotic systems. We have done this for Sony Aibo. This is using the kinds of models that we did that were actually patented and used in Aibo. Different behaviors in this particular case than the dog. And we use those as the basis for driving the robot in conjunction with motivational variables. For those of you who had an Aibo, you might remember it was called the IE, or Instinct and Emotions Model. Instincts is a passé term in biology. Emotions, most animals are not generally attributed to having. Motivations is more correct, but they serve the same kind of internal function, which modulates these behaviors based on internal state. Happiness, hunger, fear, all these other things as well, to the traditional variables that you may be used to in these kinds of systems. We've got some preliminary work right now, very preliminary, just in implementing some of these things. Don't have much data to be able to show. Populated this particular world, again, more proof of concept than anything else at this point in time, showing how it will react in different ways to the system. We intend to expand this, but this is not the answer to the question, okay? The question is still, what is the value of slowness, or what is the value of speed? This just enables us to explore at one particular end that value and also vary speeds and the like. So how we do that, as I mentioned before, in this particular case, is to try and understand behavioral analysis. We've done that. We have a proposed model for our boreal robot, which hopefully we will get some funding working with our mechanical engineering people to address a prototype of that, run simulation studies, and then test it. We have people excited both in the Atlanta Botanical Gardens to assist us in conservancy operations, as well as a California vineyard, which I like as a potential opportunity as well. Having a 2D problem in some cases easier than 3D for these kinds of things. Dealing again with the notion of communication and social behavior. We would like these systems to be able to communicate and attract each other, unlike the sloth, but more like the slow horse, so that they can aggregate and move around and communicate when there's something that has to be done. As I mentioned earlier, at least was on the slide, there is a very limited number of calls that these animals use compared to the richness of human language and other languages as well in primates, but nonetheless they do that. This is an interesting, I don't know if this will play or not, but we can try. We have a couple of minutes.
To defecate, they leave the tree once a week to visit the forest floor, where they are more vulnerable to attack from predators. 50% of three-toed sloth deaths reportedly occur on the ground while they are defecating. Researchers from the University of Wisconsin-Madison have published a study that probes the question of why sloths risk their lives to poop on the ground, and how it is related to the other organisms that live on a sloth. Moths lay their eggs in sloth feces, which provides nutrients for the moth larvae before they find a host sloth. The moths in turn help make more algae grow in the sloth's fur, which may provide the sloth with nutrients.
So in a heterogeneous system, again, we're looking at now multiple agents, in some cases, living in truly symbiotic relationships. Another example is with caterpillars and ants, which seem a popular topic for the day.
This is about to take place. The caterpillar has, in effect, shouted to the ants, "Come and get it." It's not a ploy. The caterpillar doles out sugary droplets, which the ants lap up. price of a few servings of food, the caterpillar is surrounded by friendly ants. Not a bad thing to have the neighborhood toughs at your beck and call when you have a soft body and a nasty array of predators.
So again, expanding this outward is trying to understand, again, how in some cases faster agents, such as the ants compared to the caterpillar, such as the moths compared to the sloth, why do they work together? Why does this work? What is the value of this? How do we start viewing these entire agents as ecosystems? To me, that's an important question. And capturing the environmental dynamics is one of the goals that we're dealing with. One of my students now is working on his proposal. It's still early, but looking at ways in which we can represent circadian rhythms and the notion of entrainment. One of the keys is you won't know everything before the agent gets placed into the environment. It has to learn the oscillatory effects, which are natural. You may have some preconceptions, but they're not going to be exactly correct. And this modeling can be used either in a classical format with time series analysis, akin to Fourier transforms. This T-BATS model and ARMA model uses a decomposition, and we find this for studies, for example, in traffic and pedestrian traffic in particular, to try and extrapolate that from what we see, how people move in different sets of circumstances, and how we can use that in a predictive way to guide intelligent robotic systems or intelligent machines, as you were asked about earlier. The next question is, once we do learn that, how do we integrate that in with the behavior? And we have techniques that we've used in the past from behavioral approaches, using them as pseudo-percepts, or how do you define it, advanced percepts, in this case as the ability to serve as artifactual sensors to be able to provide information to the agent that might not be immediately available and to guide its performance. This, since it's reactive, it can also deal with other issues that may come up at some point in time, but certain assumptions are made along the way for the system to continue to behave consistent with its understanding, its learned understanding of the environment. And again, other examples we're looking at for testing, for example, cleaning robots in building scenarios as well too, so that they can understand when it's appropriate to come out, when it's not appropriate to come out, not unlike cockroaches, if you will. An even newer approach that we're dealing with is another of my students who is working on this notion of carrying capacity, which means how fast does the population grow in a particular case, particularly with regard to metabolic resources, and how many agents can actually fit, and how does that cap the ability of the agent to grow and prosper in that particular environment and affect its metabolic rate as well. I haven't even looked at this in great detail yet. I just grabbed these off of a short paper I had mailed to me last night, but I think it's potentially exciting as well too. So more to follow on that. So in conclusion, basically, I just want to say that slowness is a seriously underlooked capability in robotic systems. It will afford potential capabilities that typical speeds and higher speeds cannot do in terms of long-term duration and persistence. We hope to be able to address arboreal animals and are seriously inspired by the slow-loris and tree sloth. Not, how was it put yesterday, not soft inspiration, but harder inspiration for bio-inspired systems, understanding the role of circadian rhythms and other aspects of that. And with that, I will conclude. Thank you very much.